I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. The government was facing pressure on two fronts this week. On its proposed changes to workplace laws, business groups are pushing back, and Senate crossbenchers are expressing concern about the prospect of giving unions more power to seek higher wages. The more heated argument is over energy prices. One minister lashed out at gas companies, accusing them of a glut of greed. But if greed is the problem, what's the government going to do about it? Well, we still don't know. And power prices are only part of the equation. The Reserve Bank now says inflation will rise even higher than previously thought, hitting 8% by Christmas, and then remaining above its target zone all the way to 2025. In other words, cost of living will dominate this term of Parliament. This week I was joined on the panel by Dana Morse, Clare Armstrong and Amy Remeikis. Let's start on energy prices. Clare, it's, 12 days or so since the budget. Are we any clearer now to working out where the government's going on this to help bring those prices down?
Well, apart from the signal they've been sending that they are obviously prioritising regulation as their first port of call, the actual detail of which part of regulation they're going to look at is undecided, and not in a way that, you know, they're working around in the background and they've got a plan and they're getting ready to announce it. They are genuinely out there consulting because they haven't made a decision. They could look at a price cap, they could look at some kind of reserve, maybe to control the amount of gas that's exported on the spot market, keep it domestically. Or there's also been some discussion around making that heads of agreement, the code of conduct that these companies agree to abide by, mandatory. It's voluntary at the moment, and it's sort of referred to as a bit of a gentleman's agreement rather than having any real teeth.
The price cap has had a lot of attention, the idea of a price cap. I suppose, Amy, one of the difficulties is how you apply that. Is it at the wholesale end, retail end? Is it for contract gas? Is it for spot market? There are difficulties here. One of the other issues is the states would need to be involved in anything you do on electricity in particular. So it doesn't sound like we're about to see an immediate announcement here on what they're going to do. Not
an immediate announcement, but Jim Chalmers has said that he wants to have an answer by Christmas. That's the intention, to have something out there so people know what is happening with that power, because part of that 56% increase is already starting to flow through. People are seeing it in their bills. But just on a price cap, it doesn't have to be forever, like one and done. There is talk of a temporary price cap that they could put on it. And we have to remember that these gas companies were making huge profits when gas was $3, $4 a gigajoule. It's now $30 plus a gigajoule. How much are they actually making now? And it is all at the misfortune because of people going through a war in Europe. So I think that there is patience running out within the government, with the gas companies in particular. I think that Appier's arguments about how it's tough for them to is no longer holding any water because people cannot afford to turn on their power. And that is just one part of the inflation issue that the government is dealing with. So I think, yes, the heads of agreement was meant to lower prices. We have not seen that. If anything, all it's done is stop them skyrocketing even further, but that's not good enough in this environment.
And indeed, the Treasury figures in the budget, the regulator, AEMO's figures, they all suggest they're going to keep going up, right? Now, Ed Husic clearly has manufacturers in his ear. He's the industry minister. They're worried about these gas prices. And he once again had a real crack at the gas companies this week.
This is not a shortage of supply problem. This is a glut of greed problem that has to be basically short-circuited and common sense prevail.
How do you short-circuit greed, Dana?
That's the essential question, isn't it? I mean, it's really difficult what the government is facing at this point. I think the most interesting thing is the proposal by the former head of the ACCC, Rod Sims, and saying make the heads of agreement enforceable. Like, the ACCC already know how to regulate, they know how to crack down, the market knows what it needs to do. If you move that regulation power into the hands of government, it's a massive handbrake. We've got 3 sitting weeks left until Christmas. They've promised to get this through by Christmas. It's much easier if they say, right, you're not abiding by the heads of agreement, let's make it enforceable and let's put some pressure on to actually bring these prices down.
It's interesting because the opposition are trying to keep the pressure on the government here as well, but really don't like any tough talk about the gas companies, it would seem. Angus Taylor, the Shadow Treasurer, would prefer everyone to be nice to the gas companies and give them what they want here, and that is more supply.
You cannot get supply from the gas producers if you demonise them. You just can't. I mean, asking a business to help you when you're demonising them, it simply doesn't work.
Don't demonise them, be nice. Is that a better approach here, Claire?
I think the issue is that when both sides of this argument are talking about supply, they're talking about different aspects of supply. Because clearly what Angus Taylor's referring to there is you take, for example, a project like the Narrabri gas proposal, which all of that gas being produced there, 90 petajoules, I think, is supposed to be reserved exclusively for the domestic market, which would be well and above what we would need to fill that shortfall on the East Coast. But there is also the Labor argument that supply is not the issue is also correct, because there is this extra supply that is being sold onto the spot market internationally at huge margins. That's
the supply they want.
And that's the supply they want to go after. So I think this argument that the opposition are running about don't demonise the people you want to work with, it is not wrong in the sense that you never know, what you're going to need from companies and business in the future broadly. But it doesn't really hold up when we know that the supply is sitting there, they're just making a hell of a lot of money off it. It's not like we actually need to go straight into the ground to at least fix this immediate pressure that we're dealing with.
But that ignores the fact that the gas is ours. It's Australia's resource. And as Claire says, we don't need to go into ground. We don't need to open up new projects, immediately or if ever. The gas is there. They are selling it on the spot market. It is because of greed. And we do not have a supply problem. We have a problem with not being able to afford the gas that we already have. And I do not care if the gas industry feels demonised or they're upset over the fact that maybe they won't get to make the profits that they're making, because when is it enough?
Is the issue, though, retrospectivity, that when they developed these projects, there was no requirement to keep it domestically? They did so under the rules of the law of the land, which said you can sell it internationally.
Yeah, well, guess what? Things change.
And I think as well, it's interesting that there's been a little bit of discussion about the PRRT, which is effectively, the return that Australians are supposed to be able to get from loaning our resource to these companies. It's not really functioning as intended because of the huge amount of profits that these companies are able to make, as Amy says.
What about the prospects of, if they can't fix this with regulation, giving people some help, a rebate, sending them cheques and so on? It's pretty clear, Dana, isn't it, that the government doesn't want to do that?
No.
Do you think there's a point where they might have to, though?
Well, the whole argument is that it'll drive up inflation, right? So when you've already got a situation where the lowest of the low-paid people in this country are already in a situation, they're not driving up inflation. They're not even making ends meet. They can't afford groceries. They certainly can't afford to see their power bills go up 56%. There's a way to do subsidies that is smart and targeted and nuanced. You don't have to spray the cash hose that they're always saying they can't afford to do. You can be clever about it, and I think they need to start having that discussion.
This, of course, comes, and speaking of inflation, as the Reserve Bank this week put up interest rates again, 7th consecutive month in a row, 7th consecutive increase, and also increased their inflation forecast. It's going to be a little higher by the end of the year, 8%. But then I think perhaps the more concerning is how long it's going to run. It won't be until 2025 it gets back down within that 2 to 3% target zone. What challenges does that, Claire, present to the government, do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting that those figures came out like a week after the budget. I mean, if we're talking, politics has been comparing things to the lifespan of a lettuce. At this point, I'd say a lot of those forecasts in the budget didn't actually outlive an iceberg lettuce. And what that really means is the assumptions that were baked into some of the figures in that budget are already redundant, and that's a huge issue for the government. But as well, I think it puts extra pressure on them to do something to relieve cost of living pressure. It's like Dana said, there of course is a situation where you don't want to give cash out so broadly that people who thought they were going to have to put something toward a mortgage or a power bill can now go down to Harvey Norman and buy a new fridge. But at the same time, you need to help people who are going to lose their home or not be able to pay their rent or not be able to turn on the heater next winter. And I think where a lot of these issues will really come to the fore even more will be in winter time, in 8 to 10 months, when we know that power consumption is at its highest and we'll have seen the majority of that 56% increase over 2 years.
The other thing about this longer inflation problem, is the complication this creates for the stage 3 tax cuts too, right? Because they're meant to be coming in mid-2024, and if the Reserve Bank's right, inflation will still be above where it needs to be at that point. Does that strengthen the argument, I suppose, to do something about those tax cuts, because they might come in at a time when inflation's still a problem?
There is no moral, common sense, economic, anything justification for these tax cuts. They were bad policy when they were introduced.
Not even at the middle end, though?
No, there is no sense to them. There isn't. Because when you look at the cost to the budget and what people will have to forego, because if you don't think that we're not going to get into some sort of austerity like situation to pay for them, then you're kidding yourself. We're already having conversations about whether we can afford the NDIS or not. And that is absolutely also abhorrent when you think about what the NDIS represents and what it's meant to be. It was bad policy when it was introduced. It's even worse policy now. We do not know what the future looks like other than it's going to be bad. So I think that the stage 3 tax cuts are on a very, very short time period, less than the iceberg lettuce, at least internally. I think you're right, though. I think we'll see like the top end shaved off, and there'll probably be some sort of tax cuts.
Well, I mean, surely there's a stronger argument in the middle for returning bracket creep.
But these don't do that.
Well, in the middle, what we're talking about, those on 45 grand plus, I think it's the top end that the government's more concerned about if they're going to do anything at all. But this is a debate that's just going to keep bubbling and bubbling and bubbling, right?
No, and Jim Chalmers is aware of that. We haven't seen his language change at all. He's still saying we are looking at these tax cuts. He's not standing by them in the way that we have seen the Prime Minister stand by them consistently. I think it's interesting, this government seems to be really obsessed with the idea of breaking a promise. They're terrified of it. They don't want to introduce more tax reform. They don't want to bring down these tax cuts because they said that they wouldn't. But at what point for them is it worse politically to stand by a bad promise than to institute good policy?
Well, I suppose if they lose government, they would say that's the reality of the politics, right? And it may not be that they have a problem with breaking all promises, but they're going to have to clearly break some promises at some point, given the economic situation we're in, whether it's to move on taxes, whether it's to, make some changes to stage 3. So I think given that the tax doesn't come into effect until a few budgets' time, they're going to be holding out till as long as they can to actually tinker with it.
But how people interpret the broken promise is on us as the media. And if we hound them about breaking the promise, then that becomes the narrative, when that is also bad policy. So we've got a responsibility there as well.
I think also voters expect to have a bit of an understanding of what they're supporting when they go to the ballot box, regardless of whether it's the first issue that they voted on. I think there's an importance to have transparency and honesty in politics. And clearly Jim Chalmers has shown he wants to have an honest conversation with Australians about, the reality of the situation now versus before the election, and we'll see how that plays out. But there is an expectation, I think, in the community that if you've voted for something, that thing will be delivered.
Well, time to talk to our guest this morning, the Independent member for Curtin, Kate Chaney. To take us there, here was the Treasurer, blaming war, not greed, for energy prices and making it clear action will be taken.
I think we have crossed a threshold where everybody in our cabinet, and I think most people in the Australian community, accept that when this is driven by a war, when the prices are expected to become so extraordinarily high that they risk strangling industries, then we need to do something about it. And so we are contemplating a broader range of options.
Kate Chaney, welcome to the program.
Thanks, David.
Now, energy prices are a little bit different in your home state, WA, due to the gas reservation policy that's been in place in the state for some time. Nonetheless, what do you think should be done about this energy price problem generally?
It's obviously a huge challenge, and I think it's a good sign that the government is open-minded to a range of options, although they will need to make a decision shortly. I think there is a good case to be made for a short-term super profits tax on gas exports, really to make sure that we're looking after the most vulnerable, and the most vulnerable at the moment is not our gas companies.
So you'd suggest taxing them with some sort of windfall or super profits tax and using that revenue to help those who are struggling the most with their power bills?
Whatever we do, it needs to be short term. I think that would be potentially a better solution than the export controls or price controls that end up being quite hard to reverse. But obviously, you know, the second tier of options would be those export controls or price controls. In Western Australia, we have the domestic gas reservation, which was put in place, you know, 15 years ago, and has been very effective. One of the problems with it, though, is that it's not a long-term solution for decarbonisation, and it can really embed gas in the energy mix for a longer time. So,
well, I want to ask you about that because that's an interesting point. Just on the idea of a windfall tax on the big gas companies, I mean, how would this go down in WA, in your electorate in particular, you know, where we know there's a different attitude towards resources companies sometimes?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's really challenging, but I think we have to look at the options that are available and pick the least bad option. So I'm sure there'll be some resistance to it. But looking at who's suffering and what the potential paths are out of this, I think it's the best of bad choices.
So gas then, I mean, you're in favour of stronger action on climate change and the government's committed to. There is this issue now about getting more gas supply into the market. Are you saying that we don't need more supply, that we shouldn't be necessarily opening up new gas fields? What role should gas be playing? Well,
in the short term, we absolutely need smooth transition, but we can't lose sight of the longer term goal to decarbonise our economy so that we actually have a strong economy in 20 years' time too. So I think it's really important that we focus on that these are fossil fuel issues that are driving the challenges that we have now, and we focus on that longer term goal to decarbonise.
But should new gas projects be opened up?
I don't think so. I think globally, when you look at the cost and benefit of that, there are enough gas projects that are already approved to meet the gas needs that we need in the energy mix for a long period. And so opening up new oil and gas exploration sites that won't be developed for between 4 and 10 years seems like really mixed messages that we're sending to the market.
So you've called for a windfall tax. Can I ask you about another tax question? That's a stage 3. We were just talking about it there. We've got now the forecast that inflation's still going to be a bit of a problem in 2024. You've been critical of these stage 3 tax cuts. Just tell us what you think should happen.
There's no doubt that over the long term we need tax reform, and we are relying too heavily on personal income tax in that mix, and we need to look at alternatives like consumption tax or different ways of building that relationship with our fossil fuel companies. But at this point, it seems to me that the stage 3 tax cuts are not very responsible policy. I can understand the government's desire to keep its promises, but when you look at where we are, really that there is nothing to take the place of the revenue lost in those tax cuts. So it needs to be part of a broader review of how we're going to pay for the things that we need.
But should they be scrapped altogether or just trimmed at the top?
I reckon they should be delayed pending a broader review of the tax system. And it may be that a result of that could be trimming them, you know, at the top, or it could be looking at different sources of revenue that mean we can rely less on personal income tax as we see our population age.
Again, how does this go down with your constituents? Because you represent one of the wealthiest electorates in the country. What do they think about that sort of position on stage 3 tax cuts?
Well, like in any electorate, there's a mix of different views, but I've had a whole lot more contact from constituents who think that it is not responsible to implement those stage 3 tax cuts.
Even if they're going to benefit from them?
Yeah, well, the thing that I've found really interesting in my electorate is a lot of the time people actually are not only driven by self-interest, and there is this sense that they're keen to ensure that we do have a strong and robust economy that continue to deliver on the things that we need.
Let me turn to industrial relations. Before I get to the concession that Tony Burke's just announced this morning on one element of it, what do you think generally of the bill that's before Parliament? It includes quite a few different reforms, but the most contentious is multi-employer bargaining.
The bill definitely does some things that need to be done. So there are some good things in it. And I'm completely supportive of the fact that we need to increase wages and increase the share of wages of GDP. I think the expansion, the multi-employer bargaining for the supported stream is a good thing, that those low-paid industries, and that may well get wages
like
moving.
Childcare,
like childcare, aged care, largely feminised industries, and that seems to make a lot of sense. I'm concerned about the overreach and this extension of multi-employer bargaining to any group that are deemed to have a common interest as determined by the Fair Work Commission. I think it's great for IR specialists and lawyers. It's probably great for unions and improving their relevance. I'm not convinced that it actually will drive an increase in wages across the board, because it just adds this new layer of complexity into our already very complex system.
So would you prefer to see a carve out there, only multi-employer bargaining in those sectors you mentioned, but not in mining and other sectors of the economy?
Yeah, I mean, the way it's structured, there are these multiple different streams or options on multiple employer bargaining, and one of them is this common interest or single interest stream. The bill could work very effectively in those low-paid sectors without including that.
The Minister, as I mentioned, did announce this morning that the one change he's willing to make in every workplace under a multi-employer deal, a majority of workers would have to want that to take effect. Does that look like a sensible move? Would that win you over?
Look, I think it's a sensible move. It seems to me, and it's good that government is willing to have those discussions and move on some of those things.
But it's not enough?
I think there is still a huge amount of uncertainty with what the Fair Work Commission will consider to be a common interest, and that could include competitors bargaining together. It could include geographic groupings, and I think that we'll end up with a lot of stuff ending up in the Fair Work Commission that just delays agreements from being made.
So where are you at the moment on this? Would you vote for this bill or against this bill?
As I said, it does a lot of good things, and one of the real challenges of voting on a bill is you have to pick yes or no when life is a whole lot more complicated than that.
So where are you at now?
Well, I think I would resist it. I would vote against it at the moment because of that overreach, and if that could be confined to the area of low-paid workers, plus the improvements to the boot test, the better offer overall test, which is great, some of the gender equity stuff, I think it's really strong, but I'm just worried it will create a lot of complexity in an already complex
Would it be better
system.
to split the bill, as some have suggested?
I think it would get my support if it could be split into the non-controversial and the more controversial parts.
I'm interested in what sort of consultation, briefing. I mean, the government doesn't need your vote necessarily in the lower house. It has a majority there. But has it been consultative on this?
The crossbench was briefed by the government last week. I would have liked to have seen some earlier discussion on that. It didn't allow a lot of time, and I certainly haven't had time to consult in my community very, very widely. It's pretty complicated to even understand what it's about, let alone form views on it. And for small businesses especially, it's going to take some time. So the government has been, has included the crossbench in those briefings, but very short time period.
More generally, how are you finding Parliament nearly 6 months on from the election? I mean, we were told at the time when a lot of independents came into the Parliament, things would change. We'd see a more cooperative, productive Parliament. Is that how it's turning out to be?
I'm still optimistic about it, and I think there have been some good signs that government is interested in working collaboratively with the crossbench. Obviously, there are always things that could be done better, but by all accounts, it's a whole lot more collaborative than it has been under previous parliaments, and I think that's a really good thing.
What about question time?
I still have some challenges with question time. I don't think it's the best use of our parliamentary time, and I'll continue to work with the government and the opposition on how we can make that a bit more constructive.
Well, have you got any ideas as to how you'd fix question time?
Well, I think it'd be great to see fewer Dorothy Dixes and perhaps some more electorate-based questions. And then what we often get is the same question pushed over and over again, and it's mostly political. Not a lot of it is policy-based. So I think if you listen to question time, some of the most sensible questions are coming from the crossbench.
I suspect your colleagues on the crossbench would agree with that. Look, finally, we saw this week vigils and rallies around the country for Cassius Turvey, the Indigenous teenager killed while walking home from school in Perth. A 21-year-old man has been charged with murder. Police are investigating allegations that racial slurs were used. But more broadly, how would you describe the problem and the extent of racism?
It's a huge challenge, and I was at the vigil on Wednesday, and it was very moving, and the Noongar community in Perth and the broader community is really hurting about this. On the broader issue of racism, and we don't yet know, what the motivation for that alleged murder is. I think every mum has a right to expect that her child can walk home from school safely, and I think as a community we all need to be thinking about what role we play in creating a situation where that's possible.
Kate Chaney, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Let's get back to our panel, and we're joined once again by Clare Armstrong, Amy Remeikis and Dana Morse. I'm going to come to that Cassius Turvey tragedy shortly, but let's just wheel back, if we can, to some of the points we just heard there. Kate Chaney on industrial relations in particular is clearly still unhappy. There's a bit of a concession this morning from the Minister, but not enough by the sounds of it. As I say, those votes in the lower house from the independents, the government doesn't need. But Clare, it is interesting that the pressure is still there for further change.
Yeah, not just from the lower house, obviously from the Senate crossbench as well, Jackie Lambie and David Pocock in particular. I think as well the government would do well to bear in mind that they may have a majority now, but they may not at any point in this term or even a potential future one. So the relationships and the constructiveness now can have a big impact on future negotiations when perhaps those votes do play a greater role on the floor. And I think what you'll find from across the board, apart from specific amendments or changes or issues with controversial parts of the bill, the overwhelming thing that all of the crossbench agree on is the timing and the speed at which this bill has been presented, briefed, and is apparently due to get through Parliament.
Well, it's all happening pretty fast here, Amy. Why is that?
I think the government wants to get ahead of a negative PR campaign before the BCA and associated interest groups really start whirring up and just sort of saying this is going to be terrible for the economy. We're already starting to see parts of that, as my boss Catherine Murphy referenced in her most recent column. Everyone is in agreement that wages need to lift, but certain interest groups don't want to actually see any structural changes to lift those wages. It's more like, let's have the conversation. So I think the speed of this it's twofold. One, wages haven't moved and people really need wages to start moving. And two, the campaign against this has every possibility of completely derailing everything that the government wants to do. So I think if they just go, and we're done, then they can move on to the next thing. But I will say, just picking up on what Ms Chaney said there, not briefing the crossbench until last week is not particularly great form. And I know that the BCA has been out there and briefing pretty much everyone. If you don't bring, as Clare said, the majority of the Parliament with you, you're not bringing a majority of your constituents with you either. And that's the battle the government needs to win.
And in the Senate, the government will need the Greens plus one on the crossbench. Now, that one of those could be Jackie Lambie, but she clearly still has some concerns about this idea of multi-employer bargaining.
If you don't think there's going to be more strikes, then blow me over. I can tell you what, I'll put 100% on it. It will cause more strikes. It'll be more difficult for the country. We've got to find a medium here. And I'll tell you what, the unions won't be getting it all their goddamn way. I'm about bloody had enough of them.
There you go. David Pocock is another. He is also still, he's calling to split this bill because he still has some concerns there as well. What do you think, Dana? Is the concession from Tony Burke today enough, or will he need to give a little more here?
I think he's going to have to give a little more at least. I mean, you can't split the bill. If you split the bill, the other half is never going to get through. That's just the facts. So you're going to have to see a few more concessions. But again, this is a timeline thing. And this is a government that is very keen to be seen to be doing things. And we heard Anthony Albanese say earlier in the week, I haven't wasted a day in government, and I hope you've noticed that. Well, we do notice it, but we also notice when you are trying to rush things through without proper consultation. It's an unheard of timeline to get this bill through. And I think David Pocock is very aware of that, and I think it's going to be hard to bring over the line. You
heard Kate Chaney say there should really be a line around which industries multi-employer bargaining works in. No one seems to have a great problem with low-paid feminised workforces, in particular childcare, aged care, a few other places like that. But it's clearly in the more higher paid sectors of the economy like mining that some have an issue and say it really shouldn't apply there or doesn't need to apply there. Tony Burke has played down the prospects of it even happening in mining. Have a look.
With respect to mining, again, you've got examples. It's pretty hard. Like, you go mine by mine, you've got enterprise agreements already in place in most of them. So, you know, legally, is it possible that you could have a mine somewhere where this was pursued? Yeah, it wouldn't be unlawful. But it's not really realistic if you look at the success with agreement making that's already there.
Why not just clarify that in law? Why not just clarify that in law? Because the sector is concerned that legally, under this law, it still would be possible.
Well, possible if they're not on enterprise agreements, but they are.
So if it's not going to really happen in mining, why not just carve it out?
Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? I think that there's obviously some pressure from a range of stakeholders about not having carve-outs, not necessarily because of the mining sector, but when you start carving, where do you stop? And once there's...
They've kind of carved out construction already, haven't they?
Well, yeah, to an extent they have, and I think that's probably where they're going to run into trouble when they have other industries now knocking at their door saying, me too. I think what's really interesting is just that potentially one of the concessions now being floated is this idea of a grace period, because that could be where some of those larger or higher paying employers may, you know, have this fear of getting pulled into this type of negotiation if they have an EBA that expires. So this idea of having a 6 to 12 month grace period where they can still negotiate one-on-one without automatically or, you know, risking being drawn into this multi-employer bargaining system. I think that seems like a concession the government is likely to make. But even then, I'm not sure that that is going to be enough to get the likes of David Pocock or Jackie Lambie over the line. They're going to have to do more. And there's only 8 sitting days of the Senate left this year because of estimates. They have so many other things to do by the end of the year. Honestly, I think...
National Anti-Corruption Commission and...
They want to put the Territory Rights Bill up. There are a whole lot of things that the Senate has to do. And if the government is really serious about this, you know, maybe they do have to think about having extending the sitting. It wraps up on December 3rd.
There is talk about the first week in December being added onto the Senate sitting calendar. So I know that holidays are being planned around that just in case it does happen. But I just wanted to introduce into all of this debate, unions are not what they were in the 70s or the 80s. Unions represent about 14% of the workforce now, and that is down from 40%. And they represent people mostly in those feminised industries now. Like, whenever we hear about union thugs or there's going to be mass strikes, everyone immediately thinks of the wharf or construction or mining. It's not. It's childcare educators, it's nurses, it's teachers, it's people in aged care. They are the people who are in unions at the moment. We don't have the same situation as what we had when people think about all of like the big strikes that happened the last time that we tried to make some sort of change with, you know, giving employees more power. And so this idea that the unions get everything their own way, what have the unions actually gotten in the last 20, 30 years? Like honestly, can anyone say, like, it's a big myth, but what have they actually managed to do that wouldn't have been done? And it's not their fault. It's because pretty much since the Accords, we've seen a systematic just undermining of union power in Australia. And that's where we are. And that's why we're now having to do things through legislation.
I want to turn now to the death of 15-year-old Cassius Turvey and start with some comments from his mum, who seems like just a remarkable person. She's calling for calm, wants everyone to be careful here, not to jeopardise this case.
I don't want Cassius's death to be a vessel for anger in terms of my people, racism. Look, we know it's out there, but please don't do that. It's probably one of the things that's really upset me. And I want calm in the community and in the country. I have a court case and trials, and I've got a long way to go for the next couple of years. Do not jeopardise any of that.
So police are investigating allegations of racial slurs at the time of this. We'll let that run its course, but it has prompted this broader discussion, Dana, about racism. Are Australians, do you think, aware of the extent of the problem?
No, not at all. I mean, Michelle Turvey, her strength, her grace, her compassion is incredible. but how can the country heal when most of the country don't acknowledge that this is a problem? There was some data in one of the reports this week that 1 in 10 Australians self-identify that they are prejudiced against other groups. Now, they're just the people who self-identify, not all the people that we know that engage in racist behaviours. You've got to diagnose the problem and you've got to go from the top down. It's a watershed moment for the country, but we took so long to get there. I mean, would this have been reported in the same way if it had been a white child? That's what's been going through my mind. It was so difficult to see these stories getting onto front pages and making news outside of Western Australia. And even to the point where when we look at our political leaders, it took days for the Prime Minister to be asked about this. It's been pushed back continually to Linda Burney. Most of the people that have gone to these rallies have been Indigenous politicians, and they shouldn't be carrying the can alone. It should be a united front from government, and it's been really interesting to see that most of the senior cabinet ministers have stayed silent on this.
Yeah, well, that's true. Do you think they should be actively saying something, those cabinet ministers you're talking about there, or are you suggesting this is more an issue of not being asked by the media?
I think it's both. I think they need to be actively anti-racist. We all need to be actively anti-racist. But they don't get the pressure applied. Has the opposition leader been asked about this? Have the independents been asked about this? I don't think so. It's been sort of, it's an Indigenous child, it's an Indigenous issue, and it's not. It's an issue for all Australians, and we have a duty to expect better from our politicians. Look at the way that, issues involving white children are covered. Look at the Cleo Smith saga over in WA. That was, rolling coverage around the clock. This family had to fight to get their story told.
We have seen those vigils, though, Clare, happening all around the country. And we heard from Michelle Turvey there, she doesn't want this to be a moment of anger. I think it must be said, a lot of these services, it's been love, it's been support that's been very much on show.
Yeah, absolutely. I was speaking to a few people who went to one of the vigils in WA, about 2,000 people, and they were saying, that all of the speakers, they were very respectful, and at one point a woman got on a microphone or loudspeaker and sort of started yelling, and the crowd very quickly kind of wrapped around her and said, this is not what this is about. I think it's great that the community has been really respectful of the family's wishes, because you can't imagine what it would be like for them at this time. And as important as this discussion absolutely is, you have to be mindful of the fact this is incredibly real and raw for particular people that knew Cassius. But I just think broadly, picking up on Dana's point, and that it's incredible the way you just expressed yourself. I think that Australians really don't have an understanding of this issue in a way that they like to think they do, but they really don't. For example, in the last 3 months, 2 teens in Northern Territory have died under care. And, people probably don't know that. That's 2 more Cassiuses. In different circumstances, absolutely, but they were in the care of the state. Yeah. They were our responsibility, and they passed away, and they are that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of how deeply this issue runs across the country.
Just to pick up on something you said there, Claire, about the rallies being this place of love. Of course they are, because that's Aboriginal culture. The mischaracterisation of Aboriginal culture and black people as being angry, no, they're not. It's a beautiful community. And that's exactly what we would expect to see. And I'm so glad that people have seen that on a national scale, that this is love, this is community, this is holding each other up. That's what Aboriginal culture is. And, it's been mischaracterised constantly. So it's been at least good for people to see that side.
Yeah, good point. This comes, of course, as the debate over an Indigenous voice to Parliament is, I was going to say, gathering some steam. I think there's certainly some real efforts to give this a push along. Noel Pearson, in particular, with that Boyer lecture that he's given. I'll play a bit of it here, in which he really makes a powerful case for the voice, but also gives us a dose of reality with, this confronting point.
Unlike same-sex marriage, there is not the requisite empathy of love to break through the prejudice, contempt, and, yes, violence of the past. Australians simply do not have Aboriginal people within their circles of family and friendship with whom they can share fellow feeling.
You can watch the Boyer lectures on ABC iView. Amy, is he right, Noel Pearson, there, that there's a greater disconnect on this issue than there was with same-sex marriage?
Of course he is, and he goes on to say that Aboriginal people are among the most unloved in Australia, and it's true, because we haven't done truth-telling, we haven't reconciled or even attempted to reconcile our past as settlers in this country. We see that in the education system, we see that in the political system, and now we are seeing it play out on the national stage, where we are having the First Nations people of Australia saying, we would just like a voice to know how policy is going to impact our communities, because policy has really, really, really messed up Indigenous communities over history, and we can't have that conversation without people running out and just saying it's a third chamber of the parliament, it's too much power, it's not in the it's not in the constitution for a reason, or why are we having this conversation? We should all be equal. We're not all equal. We're not. We never have been equal in this country. And until we actually reconcile with that, as Dana so eloquently was saying, we are not going to be able to have these conversations. And it is heartbreaking, but it should infuriate Australia that we can't do this.
Dana, we also heard Professor Marcia Langton this week express a little bit of frustration that other community leaders aren't doing more. Those that took part in the co-design process on the voice that she led or co-led, that they need to be out there making the case. Does she have a point?
She does and she doesn't. I mean, I'm not going to tell Marcia Langton that she doesn't have a point on the voice. She really knows what she's on about. But this has still got a long way to run. You know, you don't want to gather steam and peter out before we actually get to the voice. And there's actually legitimate discussion to be had on both sides here. We keep making the comparison to the same-sex marriage postal vote, and it's not as clear-cut along those lines. There is legitimate opposition to the voice from Indigenous people that shouldn't be devalued. They don't want white fella recognition, and they're entitled not to want it. So I think those conversations are absolutely worthy and should be being had. In terms of getting an education campaign together and getting what the voice is going to be out there, go for it, because we are still having the same conversations 6 months on from the Garma Festival. Yep. We haven't done a good job of explaining what the voice is going to be. We haven't done a good job really of explaining what it's not going to be. So I think the public could really use that information, and as much as it should be Indigenous-led, and it's absolutely black voices first, we also need to hear from the other Australians in this conversation, because we're all going to vote. It's not just going to be Indigenous people.
Exactly. It's not just, winning over those communities, that's for sure. Look, finally, I want to turn to the issue of the returned 4 women, 13 children from the camps in northern Syria, those women who went as ISIS brides over to Syria. Peter Dutton has spent some time this week in Western Sydney talking to community leaders there who are concerned, share his view that they should not necessarily have been brought back. We're talking about those who were persecuted by ISIS in Syria. The government says he's being hypocritical here, Clare, because the Morrison government brought back a group of kids, one I think was 18 years old, from the same camp. What do you think about this? Is he exploiting the politics of this, or is he raising reasonable questions?
I think that there are the communities in Western Sydney that have raised their concerns because of their experiences with ISIS are well within their rights to do so. For the opposition leader to travel there and highlight and elevate them is not necessarily the wrong thing either, but to do it in the way that he has without providing the context that has been sorely missing from a lot of this debate, which is that fundamentally we are talking about Australians. These are Australian people. If for some reason those women or those children managed to get out of northeastern Syria by themselves and find their way to an embassy, we would be obliged to bring them back. The only thing that is stopping it was the logistical situation of the situation of the camp. And I think that to say that there is a stark difference between children brought over as orphans in 2019 and what is now the vast majority of what's been brought over as children, again, it doesn't adequately address the complexities here. We know that there are going to be a long path toward, reintegrating these families into Australia. They have lived through unimaginable conditions and unimaginable horror. But they are Australian citizens and we have a duty to them. And even if that means that some are charged, some of the women are charged, and some of them face consequences for decisions made, 2-year-old, 4-year-old, 10-year-old children made no decision, and we have an obligation to them.
And the other point that certainly the Home Affairs Minister's made, Clare O'Neill, the advice, the security advice they're getting is that it's better to have them here growing up, not over there in these camps in northern Syria, potentially becoming even more radicalised and then coming to Australia. So that's got to be factored in as well.
Well, they still have Australian citizenship. They can still come any time.
Our panel, Clare, Armstrong, Amy Remeikis and Dana Morse. We'll be back shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this week with Fleur Anderson from 89 Degrees East, and a very warm welcome back.
G'day, how are you?
First Tuesday in November, the race that stops the nation and the rates that stop inflation, all in the one day. Boom.
Bam. Lots of tears.
Yep. Tears and a few cheers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Harry Bruce cartoon from the Cairns Post and Townsville Bulletin. It's got the RBA jockey flogging the Christ out of the poor homeowner horse
yeah.
on the home straight. Surely there's a rule against excessive use of the whip. And look, at least the horse is still alive. Isn't the saying flogging a dead horse?
I like the interest rate whip.
Yeah.
He's tried saying that after a few drinks. Interest rate whip.
Lovely Brett Lethbridge cartoon with the Reserve Bank jockey here trying to stop the galloping inflation.
Oh.
Woo, boy!
It's wonderful, and look at the expression on the face.
Yeah.
I mean, that is how we all feel when we're looking at the interest rate rises, isn't it?
Every time the post arrives from the bank, you just know it's bad news. You know?
Yes.
David Rowe has got the winner's circle with the inflation dragon here, and Jim's holding the little cup.
I know, and looking a little bit like he's got mixed feelings about it.
Well, yes, the connections aren't all that pleased. You should be happy about a win. And Phil Lowe here is riding the... he seems to have a percentage win.
Isn't that clever? Of course, the jodhpurs look very beautiful on a central banker as well.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think he should adopt that, Phil. He should have jodhpurs.
Maybe they need to just get the whip out.
And whips. Alan Moyer has dealt with the speed at which banks pass on the rates here as the punters seem to be run over.
Horses on the way to the finish line?
No, bankers on the way to a rate rise. Very powerful cartoon from Megan Herbert, the Melbourne Cup sweep. Being swept under the Flemington racecourse here, Matt is binge drinking, gambling addiction, animal exploitation and flood wall investigation.
Yeah, that is... I think one of the best.
Yeah.
Particularly given the floods as well. That was the map that we saw everywhere, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
As if things weren't scary enough, the cartoonists have got into the Halloween spirit. Mark Knightstraw and Anthony Albanese answering the door here.
Halloween is over.
I'm the electricity bill. It's electoral death come to touch you.
To zap you.
Yeah. I did love this. John Kadelka, trick or treat, I'm dressing as Robo-Det.
Trick or treat.
All we need to finish the horror is an Alan Tudge and a Stuart Robert, right?
Only Kadelka could make Robo-Det look cute.
Yeah, because there's nothing cute about it.
No.
This Brett Lethbridge, I've got to say, Jim Chalmers during budget week said, I know it's unlikely because I've got such large ears that I misheard a question, but what a self-own. I mean, he's given this to the
I had never
cartoonist.
even noticed his ears until he said that. It's like saying, don't look at my mole.
Yeah. Lovely Fiona Katauskas, who's got Halloween at the door here with I'm the pace of real climate action and he's the cost of living.
I love this. Little tacker here. Poor old climate change, and yet the cost of living, it's just like, hello, I'm coming to get ya.
It's been a week of racehorses, inflation dragons, political fat cats, sorted animals
And the best story was the pride of Taronga Zoo.
The lions.
The lions escaped.
Oh, wow. It was like that movie Madagascar. They were like, I want to break free. And then they got out and they thought, actually, no, we'll just go back.
Lovely Peter Brolman, who I thought the lions had recaptured, and as the bones are coming out here, and it's...
That's a bank.
That's a bank. Taronga Lions broke
free.
Which is how all mortgagees are feeling, really.
Yes, just go back into your own little cave.
Go back into your little enclosure and get under the doona and hide. Fleur, thanks very much for unpicking the events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Fleur. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Dana, you first.
Well, I was very interested by the comments made by Andrew Lee earlier this week that the incarceration rate has doubled, yet the actual offending rate is around the same. And it's down to more people being in prisons because of policing, not because of crime. Disproportionately affects Aboriginal people. The government's doing a little bit on justice reinvestment. They've now got to bring the states and the territories with them. But, yeah, it's a real problem and something that we should all be aware of.
All right, Amy.
Matt Tilley from Food Bank Victoria was on Melbourne ABC radio this week, and he told a story of a woman who asked how long she could keep a yoghurt past its expiry date because she wanted to use it as a treat for her kids for Christmas. And we talk about inflation and cost of living on a political stage. Sorry, I grew up poor, so it really hits me, but this is actually really impacting people. And the fact that we have kids who are going to get expired yoghurt as a treat on Christmas in one of the richest countries in the world is an abomination, and we really, really need to address this.
And give if you can. Claire.
The family of Cassius Turvey set up a GoFundMe aiming to raise $250,000 to support the family. They've now got nearly $700,000. The excess is going toward community programs in the area of Perth that Cassius lived to support kids, help them play basketball, all the things that he did. And if Australians are looking for a way to give back and support that community at this really horrific time, that might be a good place to start.
Yeah. Thank you all. I feel like we've had a powerful discussion this morning, so thank you.
Crying on Insiders, a new low.
Don't forget to check out the Insiders Back to You podcast with Sabra Lane and Gems Glendale, myself, this week. And send us your questions for the coming week. You can send us questions via the ABC Listen app or an email to backtoyoupodcast@abc.net.au. Now, finally, parents of little ones might need to mute this bit. How much should a kid with a wobbly tooth expect from the Tooth Fairy? Well, Jim Chalmers confessed during the election campaign to Insiders panellist and breaker of big economic news, Shane Wright, that his son received $20 for one tooth. Now, as he tries to keep a lid on inflation, the Treasurer has expressed his regret. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
He texted me and he said, how much did Leo get for the last tooth he lost? And the truth was it was $20 because neither his mum nor I are big cash carriers, and we happen to have a lobster in the wallet, and so it became $20. And I have lost count of the amount of times people have raised this with me in the 6 or so months. If I could change anything about that election campaign, I reckon I would have left Shane's text message unresponded to, and it's very timely right now because my middle child, Annabelle, 5-year-old, she's about to lose one too, and she's very familiar with the precedent that was set in April or May this year.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.